Thank you, Lee. I have to admit that nobody's ever used my name and the phrase "no baggage" in the same sentence before. I thought I'd talk for maybe about 20 minutes, and then we can just carry on a conversation because that's much more interesting along the way. But I just wanted to give a few ideas of the problems that are confronting legacy news providers, particularly. And the biggest problems today come from an issue of relevance and relevance to the contemporary situation and contemporary audiences. And I think there's really three critical challenges that are being faced. One has to do with the changing business configurations and the characteristics of the business. The second is the fact that there's a really decline in the value of traditional news and information content. And there's a few reasons for that I'd like to give my opinions on. And then there is what I think is a very unhealthy attitude toward audiences on the part of most journalists. And I want to talk about why that's unhealthy in the current environment along the way. The first issue, of course, is just this business configurations and what's happening in the business configurations around. We know that the news business is in big trouble. It's not just newspapers, it's news magazines, it's television news, it's news agencies. It's everybody that's involved in the creation of news is having financial problems along the way. And when you talk to people in the industry over and over again, they're saying, well, we just have to get new revenue and it's going to be all right. And that's a nice diluted view of the world. We have people from journalism schools and others saying, well, we'll just get the foundations or government to take care of the problem. There's some more delusion going on along the way. And a lot of the problems are just trying to preserve past operations and trying to restore the previous business environment, which is not likely to happen. But what we're fighting is really a wholesale transformation of the underlying economics of the business, and that's what's really disturbing the industry along the way. I mean, if we look historically at the business characteristics of news organizations, particularly in the 1980s, 1990s, you basically news products were widely used. They were fast-moving, high-demand consumer goods along the way. You had very inefficient markets, and by that I mean you had high market power on the part of suppliers, basically monopolistic structures that were in there. You had two-sided markets where, in fact, there was more power in the hands of the advertisers than of the consumers themselves. You had economies of scale that promoted large firms. You had economies of scope that promoted the creation of media conglomerates. And it really created very inefficient markets. And inefficient markets are great for suppliers, terrible for everybody else. And it was because of that you had a situation where we had extraordinary growth. Between 1950 and 2000, the amount of wealth in the newspaper industry in the United States increased 300% in real terms. And it was just the growth of advertising that made that possible, and the fact that you had the industry consolidating into these large firms along the way. You also had essentially cash-producing organizations, whether you were a newspaper or a news magazine or a news channel. You really produced cash. You had high cash flows, and it was a great business to be in. And anybody that takes apart business dynamics knows you want to be in an industry with high cash flow because it gives you many more opportunities along the way. It also means that you can invest off that cash flow without having to go into debt to do it, which is one of the best parts of it. If you looked at newspapers, you had really asset-heavy balance sheets. You had huge investments in printing presses, buildings, facilities, and other such things. And in fact, that was made worse in the 80s and 90s because many, particularly metropolitan newspapers, built huge downtown facilities, and that really added a lot. What got particularly problematic was late in the 90s, they started doing that on debt financing rather than on cash, which was not the best choice as we know now along the way. And of course, you had high profit yields. I mean, if you looked at the yields of news organizations, particularly during the 1990s and even into the early part of this millennium, you were getting returns on operations that were 5 to 8 times higher than the average business returns. That was a wonderful business to be in, and allowed the growth of large firms, expansion, and high dividends to be paid. There were some underlying things that were very dangerous, and a number of us that studied the industry began pointing those out starting in the 80s, and it took a long time before people realized what was happening because they didn't want to see it. And that is, you had growing consumption, and that is the population increased, so the number of consumers increased along the way, and that allowed you to raise advertising income, but you had declining penetration in the population. And what you had was, starting from about 1970s on, a drop of about 1 to 2% penetration in the audience every year. And this just built up and built up and built up and built up. And the 2001 to 2003 recession that occurred, advertisers completely relooked at their advertising expenditures and decided, wait a minute, some of these traditional print products are not as good for us. We're no longer going to be there. And then, of course, classified advertising switching out to the web created another problem along the way. Shares, of course, were highly valued by investors in the 90s, and so and it was great. I mean, it wasn't any category of investors. Both risk-taking and risk-averse investors put their money into media companies at that time. Now, all of those things are changing today in this environment. Instead of news being a widely used, high-demand consumer use, it's now become a specialized, low-demand consumer good. That immediately changes the way you have to think about the product that you're providing. The inefficient markets have become much more efficient simply because we have greater competition to provide news and information along the way, and because much of the monopoly structures have been stripped out along the way, and a lot of the economy scales and scope have been stripped out along the way. What were high cash flow organizations are now low cash flow organizations. What were heavy asset balance sheet organizations are now trying to become asset light organizations, which is an incredibly hard thing to do. And particularly hard to do because it changes your perception of what you are. Anybody that was in the newspaper business knows you like to be in the building when it started to rumble as the presses rolled. You didn't feel you were a publisher if you didn't own the press, and you could smell the solvents and feel the vibrations going on. But they're having to get rid of them, and many of them are now starting to outsource many of those critical functions along the way, as they've done with their distribution arms and their trucks and other such things being leased today. We've now gone from excess profits to normal profits in economic terms. So there's a big change that's going on. And when we look at what is really happening in terms of the business, we're seeing diminishing consumption both by advertisers and audiences. We're seeing an increase in prices for consumption along the way, but decreasing prices for advertising in real terms, which is really difficult along the way. Firms now have less ability to self-finance operations and growth than they did in the past because the profits are down. And they're having to have low debt loads by necessity. The problem is many already have high debt loads and they're having to figure out how we get rid of them. We've had 8 companies reorganize those debts, but they're still in deep trouble in the long run. And because those even though they've been stretched out, we've got huge problems there. And others are trying to get rid of the debt as rapidly as they can. And to do so, the only way you can do is squeeze more profits out, which means take it out of the operating side, which means downsize. And that's a huge problem. And of course, we're not particularly attractive investment anymore. About the only people that want to invest in news organizations these days are hedge funds who are betting against the market, and people who want to own for non-pecuniary reasons. And that's always well, there's a reason for him. He's doing so. We can talk about that in a little bit. The second challenge is, I think, one of the most interesting for people who work in the industry, and that's the declining value of news and information content. Journalists have always liked to pretend they do things that they don't do. And it's part of the difference between being the aspirations of what journalists have and the reality of what the practice of journalism is. And the aspiration and what journalists like to pretend they're doing is investigating the intricacies of foreign policy, taking apart the economic system, and exposing the abuses of power. Yet most journalists spend their time rewriting press releases, writing how parents can save money on tuition, exploring if an injury is going to affect a sports star for next week's games. I mean, the realities are very different along the way. And that creates a huge kind of problem for us. 50 years ago, when you read the newspaper, you read it because you wanted to know what the weather was going to be. You read it because you wanted to know if your favorite team won its match last night. You read it if you wanted to find out if your share prices were up or down. You read a newspaper if you wanted to know if something was going on in the schools where your kids go to school. You read it to find out about what commentators were saying about social life and public affairs. Well, all of those functions are being served by other people today and being served quite well. We now have expert journalism being practiced where, in fact, economists and physicians and scientists and bankers are practicing journalism and going directly to people without just being sources that were quoted by journalists. We now have all kinds of specialized journalism going on politics, on energy, on defense, that's going directly to the public without having to go through other journalists along the way, and that's a big change. And then we have all kinds of people that are covering things that professional journalism never did very well. And professional journalism has always had the problem that it has been institutionally centric, and that it wasn't really issue or community centric. It was institutionally centric because it had to have somebody it could call and go talk to on a regular basis as part of the beat systems. And so they just ignored certain things in the community unless they somehow became a very large issue. So now we have all kinds of people in the community dealing with these kind of issues and providing information on those in a very different way than traditional news organizations did. And we have 15-year-old girls running news sites and information sites about the hopes, issues, and aspirations of teenage women that we never heard about years ago. It's just a change in having the ability to get to a distribution platform that wasn't there in the past. The problem ultimately is we're getting a lot more information than we had before, but it's a very narrow form of information that's being passed to most people. We're getting a lot of flow of events news. We're getting a lot of disaggregated facts and massive amounts of sports and entertainment information that's out there. We're getting information that's much more truncated for quick consumption along the line, partly because the platforms require it and partly because of attention spans of people. And we have, because of the digital world, there's this constant replication of this information that just magnifies the ability. So there's huge amounts out there. But the huge amounts are really masking the fact that there's a diminishing focus on complex social issues and challenges, that we're not doing very well in terms of oversight and pursuit of accountability with this kind of news. And in-depth reporting and analysis is indeed problems, and we're all quite aware of that and the problems that are there. So news organizations are going to have to figure out how to increase their value, or they will really demise even further than they are. And obviously there has to be, if we're going to raise value, an increased emphasis on news processing. We're going to have more specialization or localization along the way. We're going to have more emphasis on an explanation, what's happening next. We're going to have to provide people some salvation from this flood of information that's coming at them, which means that we really have to spend a lot of time thinking about that curating process of what in this whole world of information that is bombarding people they really need to be thinking about on any particular day. And to do that, we have to have a very strong trust with them to do so. So this curating and certification abilities are going to become much more important along the way. But we also have to be thinking in terms of much more presentational issues, in terms of ease and convenience of use, in terms of storytelling and how we tell stories differently on different platforms along the way. Clearly, we have to be set up ourselves to be the preferred provider across multiple platforms, which is something we didn't do before along the way. But in the end, in doing so, we have to create really compelling experiences, or it's not going to be very effective along the way. And then the third challenge that I mentioned is this unhealthy attitude toward audiences. I was reminded of it as I walked across the front of the building over the archway. There's a wonderful phrase there, that the schoolmaster of the people. It's an incredibly paternalistic view, and much of journalism's philosophy is incredibly paternalistic. It was developed by elites in the early part of the 20th century. It was basically saying that journalists are there to educate and tame the rabble, which is not a really healthy kind of approach to the public. Much of the philosophy of journalism says we're there to guide the thoughts of these people that could really get out of hand, because, my God, we can't have them having their own opinions, or that could be bad. Certainly to protect social order was a great part of it, to try to preserve society along the way. And certainly the idea that the public needs to be sheltered and taken care of in some ways is part of that. And those are very paternalistic elements in terms of dealing with people, and they become very problematic along the way. The second are some really difficulties in the professional values of journalism that exist today. And the first is the real wariness of social alliances and distrust of information sources. And this detachment creates some very difficulties in the world today, because it is the interactions and shared values and stuff that bind individuals together. And journalists have, for a variety of reasons, often very good, separated themselves from things that bind, and that becomes a problem. The problem is when you separate yourself from something else, it's you and others. And you tend to look down on others in that kind of invasion. And much like police officers, journalists become very suspicious of everyone. And they don't want too many connections with people in normal life, because we have to be separated them because we're suspicious of them, or we don't want the alliances with them along the way. So we keep people at arm's length, and that creates problems. And the real problems come from the fact that in the connected world that we're moved into now, in the digital world, the network collective world aspects are missed out with some of these philosophical approaches and practice approaches that we have along the way. Because in the networked world, we're based on collaboration. We're based on relationships that are occurring in the world. And in order to have that, you have to have shared values, you have to have shared interests, you have to have acceptance, you have to have reciprocity in communication flow, and you have to have trust. And that's problematic given some of the ways that we have traditionally approached the philosophy of journalism. And you really see it when you compare the material offline world and the digital immaterial world. I mean, the offline world is built on things like structured relationships, where in the digital world it's very amorphous. We don't have the same kind of institutional underpinnings that you have in the digital world as we did in the offline world. The values in the offline world often revolve around things like privacy and concealment, where in the digital and online world it's more about revelation and transparency. Very different kinds of value systems that are there. The idea of property is very heavy in the offline world, but in the digital world it's less heavy. And so we're getting huge debates and structures and legal fights going on just because of that value issue alone. In the offline world, we deal with issues of hierarchy, but in the digital world, we deal with issues of collaboration, a very different kind of approach that is there. We move from control to empowerment. We move from formality to informality as we move. And all of these create huge problems of how is professional journalism going to respond to these kind of changes, and how is it going to do that but still maintain some of its fundamental purposes and roles in society, and that becomes an issue. The digital world is not just an issue of technology, and very often we take it as an issue of technology, but it's an issue of how is the technology going to use, and how is it changing all of us and our social patterns. And journalism exists to fit into social life and to help us handle social issues along the way. So there's a lot of thought that's going to be needed in the coming years just about how do we make these changes. And it's going to change a lot of the underlying practices of journalism as we move along, simply because the technologies are changing the way people think and interact. And if we don't change with them, professional journalism is going to die out along the way. And I'll stop with that, and we can argue over everything I said or anything else that you want to argue with. So, thanks. Yeah.
Well, let's come back to Warren Buffett.
Yep.
A value investor. He really
Yep.
works hard at
Sure.
fundamentally strong companies,
Yep.
the ownership to management.
Yep.
Generally put in place. It's not only values, but
Yep.
investors.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about
Yep.
what he sees that others
Yep.
don't. Particularly because even though he has a track record of looking at legacy companies like railroads.
Sure.
He has
Well, what Buffett has always looked for is undervalued companies. And newspapers are incredibly undervalued today. But what he's looking for is he's looking at companies that are small and mid-sized newspapers, for instance. These are producing the highest profits in the newspaper industry today. And when he's got them, they're not leveraged. And he's not buying the companies that got a lot of profits. So he's sitting there saying, wait a minute, I can buy these papers. They're producing 13% returns today. If I invest in something else, I can get a 4% return at most. This is not a hard formula all of a sudden. But then he starts looking and he's saying, so what is the future of the newspaper, of these smaller mid-sized newspapers? They have a longer future probably than metropolitan newspapers because they provide information at a level that is not being provided by a lot of others right now. And of course, metropolitan newspapers have always had the problem is that they didn't have a common audience because it was multiple communities in a metropolitan area, and they didn't know who they were talking to and never served any of them very well, quite frankly. So they've been really hurt in bad ways. So he's looking at these and saying, if I can buy them at a price where I can get it and get my investment back in 10 years, it's a good bet. And that's what he's doing because quite frankly, the multiples today, right? If you remember in the mid-1990s, the multiples for newspapers were going 200 to 300% of sales. Now a multiple of 2 or 3. Yeah, I mean it's not a bad formula. And the best you can hope to get now is multiples about 20. So it works out for him to do that, and it works out for others if they want to do that as well. Now Buffett does not seem to have any personal reason for doing this except the money. Now we all do see others in other communities that are buying papers who, shall we say, are real estate developers and others who have motives that are somewhat suspect. What I find very interesting is that in the journalistic community now, there's all of these people screaming, oh my God, private investors are buying newspapers. In the 1970s, everybody was screaming, corporations are buying newspapers. We don't like anybody owning newspapers, is the idea. We don't like big companies because, they only want money. We don't like small companies because they don't have strength to withstand power, We don't like corporations, we don't like private investors, we don't like anybody, So it's a real interesting problem for us. Klein.
Spinning off of that, we've only seen public
Mm-hmm.
So what role has that changed that go public had in this downfall?
Well, I mean, going public, people went public for several reasons. The biggest reason they went public was to gain capital. That was the number one reason, so that they could buy more, because nobody had enough money to buy more unless you went public. Because the newspaper business had been a good business up to the 1970s. You had a good income, you made a good living, publishers everywhere drove nice Cadillacs and had the nice houses and stuff. But nobody was really rich because the wealth was in selling the paper along the way. And so the problem, of course, became that as families began selling the papers, nobody else had the money to buy them because the multiples for the value of them were so high. And the only people that could buy them were companies that had lots of cash, and secondly, had ways to handle the taxes in better ways, the acquisition taxes and the taxes of income in a lot of different ways. So they could handle them in a very different way than individual proprietors could. So that just really pushed us to the big companies, and it made sense just from the economic standpoint. For the big companies coming in, you make money in two ways. You make money by getting high dividends, and so it wasn't unusual to have media companies. Newspaper media companies were making 22-25% returns. Broadcast companies were making up in the 30% returns. You know, it was a great business to be in. The second way you made money was having growth in the assets. So you could take profits out of those returns, buy new assets, grow the company, make the company worth more. Unfortunately, the share values have all collapsed and those assets aren't worth much. And everybody's having to write down the assets now. And that's been a terrible situation for everybody, because the moment you write down assets, now if you have to have debt, you pay a higher interest rate simply because you don't have as much equity in the firm. So it's underlying financial problems for the company. And so for companies today, they're looking at it. Nobody can see how they can make money on the asset side anymore. The profit side, the profits are down, half what they used to be. So it's not a great investment. So they want out of it, and they're getting out of it. Most of them leveraged themselves in the 90s. Up until about the late 90s, most of the public companies only made acquisitions for stock swaps. And then they started doing it on debt financing, which was fine until about 2007. And all of a sudden, that didn't work very well. And and we actually, Sam Zell is, of course, the biggest issue with the Tribune. It was actually a very good bet. You got to remember, Sam Zell's a real estate guy, right? Real estate guys are boom and bust guys anyhow, right? Sam Zell didn't lose money on this. His investors lost money on it, but Sam Zell didn't lose money because he knew how to do these, how to structure a relationship. But he had a very good plan, and that is buy the Tribune company in 2 years, strip out all the assets, sell off all the assets, make it a much better company, and then dump the rest of the company. It was a great idea, actually, because the Tribune company had so many assets that it didn't need, ranging from baseball to real estate and other such things. And he was predicating all of his things on the non-media operations. Well, of course, the recession hit, and the crisis hit, and then the depression after it. He had financed everything on two-year short-term financing. He couldn't extend the financing, and he couldn't get anybody to buy because nobody could get any money out of the markets. And that took the company under. But actually, the plan wasn't bad. But he was a boom and bust guy, and that's the kind of guy that gets into this business this day. So, yeah.
You talk about journalism needs to embrace all of these new realities.
Yeah.
While still serving the fundamental goals, right? As soon as you go back to the comments about really good investigation,
Yeah.
accountability. Does your crystal ball have any way of guaranteeing that people will pay for that?
Well, they always have. But what we have to understand is if you go back to 1880s, okay, back in the days when newspapers were 2 and 4 pages, okay, very little advertising because we didn't have manufactured goods, so we didn't have much in the way of advertising. The price of a newspaper in those days, in today's rates, was about $3.50 to $4 a copy, okay, in today's rates. You know, we pay today a third to a quarter of that still, you know, even with all the price increases going on. The problem is there's only a small amount of people that are willing to pay that amount. And we've deluded ourselves during the 20th century that people wanted to read newspapers and to read news. Fact is, most people never wanted to read news. They didn't care about the news. That's why we added sports. That's why we added entertainment. That's why we added automotive. That's why we added lifestyle. All of these things were added to get the audience who didn't want to read the news. Because the news is only about 15–20% of the content of most newspapers. But we added all those things. So those people that were interested in sports, they were more interested in watching it live on television than reading about the next morning. Okay? They might come to us for the stats. They might come for us for a little more discussion of it. But they really didn't care about the newspaper anymore after we had live television broadcasting of sports. And then internet comes along and can give them the stats and everything much quicker and easier than they wanted to. So they kind of whittle away. We had cooking in there. We had food sections. Primarily, we had food sections for two reasons. One, we were trying to attract women. More importantly, we wanted to get the food advertisers and all of the stuff that came with that. They're gone. So now we've got these food sections and very little advertising supporting it. So we're losing money there. They are read now by both men and women because food, but still, food magazines, which have proliferated, are doing a much better job. If we can watch it on television, and we have food channels and other such things, so we've lost part of the audience. So we've lost lots of the reasons for many of the sections that are there. So at some point, we're going to see, right now, newspapers have shrunk for two reasons, primarily because the advertising's out, and advertising dictates the number of pages, but also because we're reducing staffs. But I think we're going to see most newspapers shrink back down to 8 pages, 12 pages. And it's going to be much more news. And the people that are going to pay for that are going to be people, 20% of the population maybe, that wants news. That wants news different from what it's getting from the side of buses, what it's getting from the elevators, what it's getting on its internet site, what it's getting from the millions of places we now get general news and information. So there will be some people who will pay, but they're not going to pay for the crap. They pay for something that gives them value, and we've got to figure out what that is. Yeah.
Getting into the third problem, we talk now about
Yep.
on journalism and all that. So from your perception, is that more than talk?
We're seeing some start to. But it's a bit of a problem still because we still have this universal idea that we need to be serving everybody. But we do see some differences, and some news organizations are doing better than others in terms of trying to get close to their audiences. It's a lot easier to get closer to your audiences in a digital world than in a non-digital world. And some are starting to harvest that fairly well. And in the UK, the two best performers are a quality performer and a non-quality performer. Okay, the best performer in you want to take a guess? The Guardian's the quality performer, and it is now the worldwide the largest online site of quality, and it's got a huge problem. Because it's now having to invest all kinds of money to serve people in the U.S. and Australia and India and all kinds of other places that it never did before. It has 5 times as many people reading it in the digital than in the non-digital. It's doing very well.
And more in the United States than the UK.
And more in the U.S. than the UK. And so it's really having to upgrade its U.S. coverage and figure out why people read the Guardian in the U.S. And that's they're doing some interesting things. The second one, which is now the largest newspaper site in the world, is the Daily Mail. Which, by the way, for all the nasty things you can say about it, both in tab and online, is in fact one of the best edited newspapers you will ever see if you actually look at the way it's edited, the way it moves people through the stories, way it juxtaposes things and moves along. Otherwise, if you care about serious news and other such things, it drives you crazy, but it's really a well-edited publication. It's not much of a newspaper, but it's a great tab.
Is your perception that both of those
Are very close to their audiences, but they're different audiences. They're very different audiences. So,
I remember you saying a few years ago that 2/3 of Americans hated newspapers for 100 years. They just didn't have anything else.
yeah,
So there's this whole notion of a static core.
yeah.
Is that still, this was several years ago, is that idea of the static core still?
Well, we're down. I mean, I think we're getting close to where the core is still there. I mean, most of the penetration rates in most states in the U.S. are down at around 25% of the population or of the households. So there is a fairly good core. I mean, we were up to 60% at one time, but all those people have gone someplace else because they're getting things they want someplace else. And that, by the way, a lot of people attribute that to the internet. It's not. It's just been consistent. Once we had television, once we had cable news, and the internet came along, and the internet really didn't change it all that much along the way. It's been fairly consistent downturn. What changed it was when the advertisers said, we're not playing this game anymore, we're not paying the high rates for the smaller audience that we're getting. So there is this group that didn't really care about news, but they bought the newspaper because it was entertainment. It was, what are you going to do sitting at home in the evening?
So, put it in a way that people want the stamp column and the sports column.
Yeah.
The classroom, how those were subsidizing those of us who had the real news habit.
That's right.
Not interested in doing that anymore. So that splintered. So it's the only strategy that makes sense for people to follow them. Really your point. You want the sports quality news is a splinter strategy. It's a target strategy and higher price strategy.
At the moment, that's the one that's working at the most, and moving along. With the exception of, and this is one of the problems that when you look at the digital world, everybody wants to talk about the New York Times and the Times of London and the big players and stuff. They are not the industry. Okay, they are the outliers. And one of the problems of the digital world is that in order to really make money in the digital world, either off an ad strategy or even off of a paid strategy, you've got to be one of the big players. Okay, and that means you got to be the leading national players, certainly the leading player in your state, or you're not going to be able to do. Because 85% of advertising goes to the top 10 sites in the country. And we've got about 3 media companies in there, and that's about it. You're not going to get that. You're not going to get huge digital subscriptions unless you are a major player that everybody wants to go read, and that means you've got to be the paper of record for whatever.
It's
Yeah.
own splinter strategy because it
Yeah.
must be the newspaper to the world.
Yeah, exactly.
There's only one.
Yeah, and
Perhaps
so
the Guardian might be
yeah.
better.
But and so they're starting to do fairly well. And if the Times now is getting more than 20% of its income off of digital, these days, and that's not bad. That's not bad.
But it is no longer just a metropolitan.
Not at all.
Which is why
Not at all.
metropolitan newspapers, they can't follow that.
They can't follow it. Exactly. If you're not one of those players, you've got to have a different game. And that's the one place I wouldn't want to be today is owning a metropolitan newspaper. Be happy to own a mid-size, but not a
I'd like to sort of switch the
Sure.
conversation a little bit, instead of trying to pull legacy media
Yeah.
into the picture, which is
Yeah.
and you haven't mentioned some people who are building the future.
Sure.
Right? I believe we're going to have problems just like legacy
Yep.
media has had.
Yep.
Somewhere down the line, they're going to get
Yep.
slammed. It's Twitter, it's Google. There's a lot of people now
Yeah.
that are in the publishing world or in the information
Yeah.
world who have figured out ways to put a high value on information.
Yeah.
And that's part of their
Yeah.
strategy. So, you predicted 20 years ago the problems newspapers were going to have. So if you were talking to that
Yeah.
kind of audience today, which is, I think, like talking to our students who do not read
Yeah.
newspapers. But if you were saying, here's, what is the impact they're going to be having or are having, and what are the challenges they
Yeah.
might have?
Well, if you look at the digital world as a whole, the biggest thing we have to remember when you look at the digital world is there are no media companies in the digital world. Everybody's a media company. And I don't care whether you're an automobile company or whether you're a retailer or whatever. You are now operating as a media company because the food companies are doing recipes and doing all the kinds of things that used to be on the food pages and in the food magazines and on the television programs about those. I mean, they are in direct competition for all this kind of information. Most of them don't care about news, but they are in direct competition for all of that kind of informational content that's in our newspapers. Organizations are doing all of that. You don't read the newspaper to get the school lunch list these days. You go online to the school board or to the school itself to see what that's about. All of those kind of informational things are there. So then you have the big digital players. You have the Googles, the Microsofts, the Twitters, the Facebooks, the Yahoos, the Apples that are sitting there. They have had an extraordinary 10 years, but are already starting to lose a lot of what they gained. Simply because they're now getting competition in a variety of ways. Also because one of the problems whenever you have a general purpose technology that comes into play is over a period of time it creates great disruption, and in disruption and chaos there's profit, but then normal kind of business arrangements start appearing that start stripping those away. And so we now have courts and governments saying, wait a minute, you can't just take people's content and not pay for it. We now have Google making ad share deals with organizations, just made the deal with the Belgian publishers to give them an ad split for whenever they use. Those things are coming, and so a lot of these profits are going to come down. The other thing is when you look at all those big companies, they're not making much in the way of profit. They've got a lot of cash that they're sitting on, but they're not making much in the way of return. Partly because they've been just building their way to bigness very rapidly in doing that. Now they're sitting there with cash, and people are saying, and the investors are starting to ask ugly questions, as the problem Groupon has just had as an ad company, as the investors are saying, and you've got this big company, but might be nice if we made some money. And that's and that's what's happening to Facebook now, and it's happening to Twitter. Everybody's getting pressured. So you're going to see them calm in a way. They're also facing an awful lot of regulation right now from on everything from privacy to competition law to other such things. So we're kind of normalizing the industry. This is the same patterns we went through with other general purpose technologies that came along historically. And you get some sort of organization, basically government and law and policy, and in some cases even just the businesses getting together and organizing new industry.
So you like the French Revolution continuing, the revolutionaries consume the others?
Well, we're gonna wait and see.
You're supposed to have a crystal ball.
We're going to wait. It's not a crystal ball. It's a matter of how do you prepare yourself as a company in terms of strategies of which way it could go. Well, the thing is, we don't know where it's going to go, but we know it's normalizing. And at some point, these other companies are not going to be as attractive as they were, and they're not going to be as strong as they were. If you already look at what Microsoft's done to Apple, it's really chastened Apple in the last couple of years. You're starting to see normalizations occurring in that some of the big powers that were held are now being diffused in an awful lot of ways because there's too many other ways to do things. But we have problems. I mean, newspapers got themselves into huge problems when they refused to move into a lot of these fields along the way, and they allowed others to come in. Newspapers have been screaming, holy hell, about the app stores, because they're having to pay as much, well, on Apple, 30% of the sale on Apple. They could have set up a cooperative app store years ago, as this all started. The magazine industry is doing that now, setting up their own app store as a joint one, simply because they don't want to pay 30% of the sales to a retailer. And they'd rather have it done as a cooperative. So you've got now all the big magazine companies are banding together to create this. I mean, it makes sense. But newspaper publishers never liked each other. You know, it's the problem with newspaper. You know, no, I mean, newspapers are different from others. The idea of cooperating with anything about any, you did it all yourself, and everybody else you went against, and yeah, exactly, and they all failed because people just wouldn't come on. Companies wouldn't get together. And so they lost and been now at the mercy along the way. Now they're starting to come back. Some places are doing better. I mean, you know, the leading pay platform in the world today for newspapers is a company called Piano Media, which many of you may not know. It's basically providing all the newspapers of Central and Eastern Europe have banded together and are using this one pay platform. And why are they doing it? Because to make a pay platform work, you've got to have many services in there to get the economies of scale to make it work. You know, if you've got 1 million people using, you're fine. But if you've got 30,000 people using the platform, you're in deep trouble on the financials of it. So they've all joined together. Now, why is it that you could get this innovation work among publishers in Central and Eastern Europe, but can't get it working in the U.S. or someplace else? It does make sense.
They were communists.
Oh, they were used to collectivism. That's it. That's it. Used to that collectivism. Yeah.
What does this all mean for those operations in democracy?
Yep.
Getting up and saying, we need a free press.
Yep. Well, you have different things happening. I mean, the normal thing that happens in the pattern of when you have an emergency in democracy, and particularly if you have a transitional period, as happened in Central and Eastern Europe, it's happening in much of the Middle East right now, is you suddenly get a huge splurge of papers. I've been working for the last year and a half in Libya, which has been one of the most interesting periods of my life. And I've been an advisor to the Libyan National Transitional Council, which is grander than it sounds. It's a bunch of shopkeepers and school teachers and others who don't know anything about media trying to make media policy and figure out what they've done. But they went from 4 newspapers to 238 newspapers. They went from I think it was 3 radio stations to now they've got about 20 of them, all operating illegally, by the way, which is one of the things we're trying to straighten out. They just now have a parliament now for about 3 months, so they may get around to dealing with legalizing spectrum allocation and other such things. But they got bigger problems now. They got to get everybody with the guns off the streets. It's a problem. You got about 7 major factions that don't like each other. You know, this is not real good for stability. But yeah. Well, most of them are publishing. That's because and basically most of these do have newspapers representing factions and factions within factions. A lot of it's tribal. But right now they've all been publishing and doing things because everybody wants to speak. Because anytime you have social upheaval, people want to get their voices heard and be part of it and try to get something done. And then after a while it normalizes and goes back to a more few. And so you're getting these kind of things all around the world. Newspapers are easier to control than almost any other kind of communications because, first of all, you have to have paper. In most parts of the world, you import paper. Very easy to control. Okay, that's the easiest point of control. You don't have to put anybody in jail. You don't have to upset the international community. You just tax the hell out of paper, or you have it and you supply it. As the government agency. But social media, other things are changing things dramatically in many parts of the world. But there are other parts of the world where the news industry and the newspaper industry and others are doing great. You want to own a newspaper today, you go invest in China, you go invest in Indonesia, you go invest in India, some of these, where they're just absolutely booming. India has 250 all-news television channels. Okay? I mean, think about that, 250. Now, it's helped by the fact that there's a weird Indian rule that says you can't have news on radio. That's another issue. But because of the population, because of the languages and other such things, there's a huge market there. and because there's many people that want to ensure they have a voice for some reason. Sometimes economic, sometimes political, and others. You have all these channels there. So you're getting a lot of voices in the world today that we didn't have before. It's a great time for communications.
Well, newspapers in India and Indonesia and
Yeah.
other places that are doing well.
Yeah.
Sounds like it may be because the maturity of the civilization there, or the democracy,
Yeah.
the state of the
Well,
countries has to do with the increasing the relevance of the content.
yeah.
And so I guess my question is, are they just behind the curve that Western civilization's gone through in terms of the decreasing relevance of the content, or is there something else at play there that?
Well, there's a couple of things at play that are really important, but it's actually following a pattern of the West if you actually look at it. The first thing was rising literacy, and quite frankly, all of these countries have spent the last 30 or 40 years building literacy. Huge amounts of money put into building literacy. Education would be very, very big in all these countries, and that's a critical component for all kinds of things. One of the problems that occurred with the Arab Spring is they had all these people they educated, had aspirations, and then society couldn't deliver them any opportunities, and they're going, something's wrong here. Whoops, education comes back and bites you in the ass every now and then. The second thing that happened is just the changing economies in these countries, particularly in Asia. You've now had a rise of people with extra money, so they're buying consumer goods. Companies want to reach them. How do you reach them? Through advertising. And newspapers are a very cost-effective way to reach large amounts of people, and it works very. So that's coming in on it as well. And quite frankly, the newspapers are generally private or quasi-private, and are given more leeway in most countries, even controlled countries, than broadcasting is. And so they're a little more fun and doing more things than others. And that's even in countries like China and others. So, you have much more leeway today in newspapers than you do in broadcasting. So you've got all of these factors kind of coming together. So you get this just growth of consumption right now and a lot of money pouring into it. And it's a great time for it. Will that continue? Well, it'll continue until the advertisers have a better place to go. That's my own version of it.
A little bit more about advertising
Yeah.
specifically. When you talk about trying to make it more personal,
Yeah.
more intelligent, and engaging.
Yeah.
Is there enough of an upside
Yeah.
there to be optimistic about?
Well, I mean, no, no, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the major companies of the world today, well, let's go back 25 years ago. 25 years ago, if you looked at marketing budget, because this is where advertising is part of a marketing budget. If you looked at marketing budgets, advertising was 70, 80% of the marketing budget 25 years ago for big companies. Today, it's 25%, 30%. They're spending all this money in other ways because they would much rather talk to you in another way. It's much more. I have a problematic wife who makes more money than I do, and that means that I have to be nice because she has to like me for just being a wonderful person. So but we were watching television one day, and this ad for BMW 5 Series comes on, and I happen to like cars she's never been particularly interested in. She goes, "Oh, that's a pretty car." I think, that's great. And she clicks on it. She stops the program stream, clicks through, and goes through to the website. Now, to catch her attention, I don't know, what's it cost these days? 5 cents on a television ad at the most to catch her attention. Went to the website. She's playing around on the BMW website. She gets the color she wants. She puts some leather seats in. She does some other things. This is great. Now, this probably cost them $2.50, $5 to ever make this. 18 hours later in the post, a color-printed, digitally printed brochure comes to her with her car on it that she had played with online. Okay? You're now probably talking $20, $25 worth of expenditure. But more than that, it had a phone number on it of the person and a name of the person who would come and bring the car out to her to have a test drive. Now this is marketing, okay? And this is the problem. Advertising is getting marginalized So if we think that media advertising is going to save media in the future, money's going elsewhere because there's much better ways for advertisers to talk to consumers than media advertising. And so, pardon? Not yet. I'm waiting for it. But damn, I'd really.
So that's that. So that's the nature of literacy. Literacy would be developing the size of the core audience. Otherwise, you're going to have a capped universe.
Yeah.
In terms of the amount of quality journalism that can be produced on a certain type.
Yeah.
So, and then with that, the issue of
Yeah.
public trust, what can be done?
Yep. Well, we got all kinds of problems. I mean, in the U.S. now, today, we have about 30% functional illiteracy. Anybody looked at the rates? It's functional illiteracy in English, but it's functional illiteracy. So this is something we have to take a look at. In the rest of the world, there's some other factors that come in. Let's remember, folks, a third of the world does not have electricity. Okay? This creates a little bit of problem if you're going to go online. A little bit of problem if you're going to have television, a little bit of problem if you're going to have mobile, because at some point you've got to plug in that phone. So there are these underlying basics that we often forget about that we have to deal with if we're going to make it work. And so we need to think about those. And now what you see in some countries now where literacy rates are low, you're basically seeing both in print and in digital communications, going back to the kind of, remember back at the turn of the century, we had all these photo newspapers and magazines, the illustrated graphics and things of that sort. Those are kind of coming back in many parts of the world where you have low literacy, where you're getting much more visual kind of communications. Online and in mobile today, AV is just booming, and it's particularly when you go to Africa and places where literacy rates are fairly low. So you're starting to see a lot of changes in that regard. So you've got to be thinking about who's using this on the other end and how are they using it. Lee looks like she's going to hit me, so it must be time to stop.
So